Our next speaker, which you may also know, a well-known dealer from London, Michael Backman. And Michael, you wrote this wonderful book, Malay, Silver and Gold, Courtly Splendor from Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Brunei and Thailand. And I asked you to bring some objects from your private collection, which you did. And fortunately, customs did not open your suitcase. So you had to wait a bit, I'm sorry about that, but you have the floor now, Michael Backman.
Thanks so much, Renee. It's such a pleasure to be here. I just love this topic. I love Malay culture. I love silver and gold, and as we all do, I suppose. And it's so nice to be here to share this sort of passion with other people who are sort of like-minded. It's quite exciting. What I'll do is I'll go through the book in some detail, and of course some implications for collectors, since I know a lot of you like collecting. The first thing I want to convey is that the book is not simply a catalogue of photographs with captions. Indeed, there are almost 500 photographs, but there are also 20 chapters and about 100,000 words. So there is a lot of research in there. So it's not just one of these books with, increasingly these days, you see big, thick books with a lot of pictures and captions, and then someone sort of walks off and says, well, I'm the author. And I'm thinking, well, is that really being an author? So what I wanted to do was to present a serious book with serious research, and also to challenge existing understanding in this area. But also I wanted to produce a book that is relevant to collectors as well as curators. And I know in that regard, when you write a lot, there's always a lot that can be seen to be controversial. And what I wanted to do in this area was to really push out frontiers. And when you're trying to do that, then there is no choice. You are controversial. Otherwise, I think you haven't done a good job. What I'll do first is to give you some background on the Malays, and then we'll take a look at photographs of lots of objects, because I know we want to see pretty things as well as just, the intellectual component. Because it's certainly important to provide the context for the objects. The first thing that I want to do is to convey, now this is really important, where the Malays are from. And very often when I say that I've done a book on Malay, silver and gold, people assume that I'm talking about the Malays in Malaysia. They think it's a book about Malaysian gold and silver. And that's absolutely not the case. Because if you look at this map, the red areas point out sort of the Malay lands. You can see the bit in the middle, the long bit hanging down, that is of course Malaysia. Then of course on the left of that we have Sumatra, and then we have the coastal parts of Borneo, and there are a lot of Malays there as well. And then Singapore, that little dot hanging off the end of Malaysia is there as well. Of course, the Singapore Chinese would say, well, this is not Malay land, but if you ask Malay people, it certainly is. What I'll do is to talk briefly now about what the Malays are not. For too long, a lot of our understanding of silver and gold from Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula has been dominated by artifacts from the Minangkabau people. The Minang people live in sort of the southern highlands area of Sumatra. And indeed, the Sumatran collections in many museums, including here in the Netherlands, tend to be dominated by Minangkabau items, despite the fact that it is widely understood that the Malays commercially dominated the region prior to colonization. As I argue in the book, the Minangkabau were quite poor. Their main export from the Minangkabau highlands tended to be themselves in the form of economic refugees. They were almost like the Sicilians the Sicilians of Sumatra. They migrated because poor people tend to migrate, rich people don't. But during the 19th century, the Minangkabau became essentially a client group of the Dutch. And with the age of photography, The traditional dress, the jewellery, and the housing of the Minangkabau became more and more over the top. I'll show you what I mean. So this is a sort of photograph that you'd see repeated ad nauseum, over and over and over, in museum exhibitions and in catalogues and so on. And it purports to be a village of Minangkabau people, but very rarely is this sort of photograph critically analysed. And everyone here is dressed up like an aristocrat. And what village do you come across where everyone is an aristocrat? So increasingly, the Minangkabau were doing, what they needed to do to attract attention and to attract the attention of the Dutch colonisers. With attention came money. Now, the much celebrated Minang village of Kota Gadang, for example, became something of a Disneyland towards the end of the late 19th century for Dutch visitors. The houses became more and more fabulous. Initially, they're quite famous for these sort of buffalo-type structures on the top of the roofs. Now that, in the 18th century, was reserved for just the senior people, the aristocrats. By towards the end of the 19th century, almost every house had these sorts of structures, again at the behest of Dutch visitors. So the houses became more fabulous and more extreme and more aristocratic. Souvenir production was ramped up so that by 1890, the village of Kota Gadang was recorded as having no less than 347 silversmiths working in it. That's a ridiculous number. They're not all there producing things for their own personal needs. They were there producing trinkets and souvenirs for the Dutch. And of course, where did these items end up? They ended up in the museums here in the Netherlands. So there's a lot of talk today about the Minangkabau and how commercially and culturally important they were. But I argue that this was very much a late 19th century phenomenon, artificially encouraged with subsidy from the Dutch colonialists in search of the exotic, in search of the other. And these sorts of show villages became wonderful places that you could take 19th century visitors to show off, to show what good, colonial administrators you were. So in my view, the real heroes of the story at this time, the Malays, have largely been ignored, and particularly by museums. Now, if you sort of Google, if you go onto sort of the world museums here, the websites and so on, and put in Minangkabau, you will get hundreds of objects. Put in Malay, and you get almost none. So one of the problems for the Malays is that they had the misfortune to peak before the age of photography. Now, it's incredible how the invention of photography has distorted our cultural memory. It's very unfortunate. And then you see this repeated over and over and over in books, uncritically. And the reason why you see it repeated over and over is because the photographs are so fabulous. But being fabulous doesn't make it right. And so rather than seeing Malay arts well represented in museums, we see instead today the flashy trinkets and the over-the-top wedding crowns of the Minangkabau. I'm being very direct. I was born in Australia. This is what we do. And the thing is with the Minangkabau wedding costumes and these incredible, ridiculous wedding crowns where brides could barely walk without bits falling out and so on, is that they got into museums and private collections because they were affordable and plentiful, and a lot were being made, and because they were so showy, they're the sort of thing that people would want to see in a museum. And so these were being produced just when the Dutch were looking for things to put into their museums here, and also in Jakarta. The other thing that facilitated this is that a lot of the curio traders at that time were Minangkabau, and so they were pushing their own product. And in Singapore, a lot of the curio traders and antique dealers in Singapore at that time, in a street quite close to Raffles Hotel, they were all Minangkabau. And another aspect of this is that very often you will have inscriptions on some of the items, and you'll notice it'll be in Minangkabau rather than Malay or something else. Again, it's because of the influence of the antique dealers at that time. Even today, the antique trade in a lot of, apart from Bruce, who's not Minangkabau, but as you might have noticed, but a lot of the dealers today in Jakarta are still Minangkabau. And I think a lot of you would have been to Jalan Kebon Siri Timur in Jakarta, and one of the most famous dealers there is Jody. He's a Minangkabau, and his son is Minangkabau. And in fact, a lot of that whole street is, and that's one reason why these items from Sumatra are being pushed all the time, because this is where they have the connections, the family connections too. So, right, I'm just getting ahead of myself. So, all of this is despite the fact that in the 18th century, the Malays, as we know, controlled most of the coastal trade in the area. And when Dutch and British traders came to Southeast Asia and came to the Indonesian archipelago, they needed to learn Malay in order to do business. Now, another problem when it comes to sort of collecting in this area is that a whole class of silver objects held in museum collections, particularly here in the Netherlands and also in the British Museum, are identified as being Malay and from Riau, the Riau archipelago, which is a group of islands just below Singapore. But almost certainly are neither. They're not Riau and they're not Malay. And this has further obscured what actually counts as being Malay. By the early 20th century, most Malay silversmiths had died out. They'd stopped work. Very little was actually being produced. And Malay tastes had changed. They didn't need these sorts of things that were being produced, the plates and the bowls and so on. They were having more modern things that were being produced and imported instead. But then suddenly, around 1920 and into the 1930s, huge quantities of silver, supposedly Malay, started to pour onto the market and to make their way into museums, including here in the Netherlands, and into private collections. This sort of silver is very showy, it's very big, incredibly thin, and with a low silver content. And it's in my research, it became clear that this silver was made not by Malays, but by Chinese silversmiths operating in Singapore, using a Malay style, and in fact even asking Malay people to design things and to design motifs. Sometimes you see krises on it, and you know, like a crossover kris. Now, a Malay would never do that, but of course, as you know, Europeans, we all love the idea of a kris. It's so exotic. So these sorts of things were being produced because they were exotic and interesting for local tourists to Singapore around the 1920s. Here's an example of what I mean. So this is a photograph that was taken in the 1950s in the Colonial Institute here in Amsterdam, and it shows a collection of Malay silver, except that not a single piece here is Malay. Every single piece is one of these forgeries done in the 1920s to attract visiting Dutch and British travellers as they came through. And the stuff became increasingly large and ridiculous, but perfect to take back on a passenger steamship. And so this is exactly what these were made for. They're incredibly light. I would have liked to have brought a piece here, and it would have surprised everyone to pick it up, because you go to pick it up and you go, oh my God, and because it has no weight. And that meant that they were cheap for tourists. And today my silversmith looks at it and thinks, how on earth did they hammer things this finely and put it together without it springing apart? But so this, even today, there was an auction last week, and it was a huge plate that was offered in London. And it was, again, one of these things, and it was described as being Malay, and it isn't. It's Chinese, produced in Singapore. Very often, these they have Jawi inscriptions on them as well. Jawi is the Malay version of Arabic, and the inscriptions are just rubbish. They're wrong. It always talk about this plate belonged to Tunku such. It's always a Tunku, you know, a prince, and then a date will be given of 1722 or whatever, and then so the date is completely wrong. And then Annabelle Gallup at the British Library, she and I were trying to work out who some of these Tunkus were, and they never existed. So the fakers went to a lot of trouble to even put on fake inscriptions and so on. And anyway, so this, a lot of this has now been transferred to the World Museum, Museum of World Cultures, the Tropen Museum as it used to be, and is still labelled as Malay. Not only is the art of the Malays often ignored or misrepresented, it's also under-researched. Until now, there's only been one book on Malay silver, and that was really produced around 100 years ago by an Englishman called Henry Ling Roth. Now, he worked for a provincial museum in Yorkshire, and it turns out, even though this book is cited over and over and over, it turns out that he never went to Southeast Asia, ever. In fact, it's not even clear that he even met a Malay. But he still did this book, which is repeatedly cited over and over. Excuse me, that book was based on just a few small collections collected at one point in time, only from the Peninsula Malay, or the Malay Peninsula, and that happened to be brought back by several colonial administrators around the late 19th century. So what he was drawing on was not the whole corpus of Malay silver, it was just some examples from some parts of the Malay Peninsula. But that really has been the most authoritative text on Malay silver and gold for the last 100 years. And it's always interesting, you know, when a book is published 100 years ago, people keep citing it over and over and over because they think, oh, it's so old, it must be right. And but what I did, and this is a bit of a COVID project, you read these books and you sort of think, actually, is this plausible? And increasingly I kept thinking, actually, no, it's not. I don't believe a lot of this sort of stuff. And so when it came to describing objects and describing motifs, he was looking at it very much through an English prism. So he would look at flowers and describe them as a rose pattern or something like that. But of course, if you're Malay, you don't know what a rose is. It's something else. So in preparing the book and in my research, I was helped by two things especially. The first is that by the early 20th century, a lot of Malay gold and silver was sold off by the Malays. It was no longer in fashion, and it was often sold to fund you know, children's education or a wedding or maybe the Hajj. It wasn't stolen. As you know, these days we're used to being told everything, you know, we've stolen everything. In fact, we were having a dinner last night, we were saying it's much easier just to buy things, even in the 19th century, than to go and steal it. So, and the thing is, thankfully, because people were collecting it back then, both British and Dutch people, it's been protected. If it wasn't collected by collectors, it would have been melted. Because today, when you go to Malaysia and Indonesia and Sumatra looking for Malay gold and silver, there's almost none to be found. Where is it in the world? It's here, and it's in Great Britain. So these are the two places where you find it. And for me, a lot of the book has pieces that I own. And where did I find it all? I found it mostly in the UK. Almost not a single piece do I think did I buy in Malaysia, for example, or Sumatra. The other thing that has been extremely important in my research is that I came across a dictionary prepared in the late 19th century by this man. This is Richard Wilkinson, and he was an a British administrator on the Malay Peninsula. And he actually put together a Malay-English dictionary of 2 volumes, and it's over 1,000 words. And this is another thing why COVID was actually quite useful, because I actually sat and read the damn thing. And what was quite remarkable is that he actually just happened to be a collector of Malay silver. And so he had a very distorted sort of sense of Malay, because he was terribly interested in all of these terms, Malay silver terms, and recorded them all. And many of these terms have now been forgotten. And so he would record, the name of a plate that's this big, and if it was bigger than that, then it had a different name, and then a small one would have a different name, and over and over and over. So I went through the 1,000 pages looking for all of these references to sort of bring them back into circulation. So it was extremely useful for me to do that. Now, turning back to the Malays themselves, I showed earlier the map of the Malay lands. There's several other aspects that I need to sort of tell you about before we actually get onto more objects. The first important aspect of the Malays is that they were riverine people. They lived along rivers and estuaries. And so this is a typical Malay village in Ipoh on the Malay Peninsula, and you can see it's perched right alongside the water. Now, the rivers were really important in the 18th and 19th centuries in Southeast Asia because they were like the highways of the day. They were the way to get goods into the inland peoples. And what the Malays would do, and the sultans, would be to establish themselves at the mouth of a river and then tax everything that went up and down the river. And so this is how the sultans earned money. And so with that money that came from the taxes that they raised, they were then able to afford the silversmiths, court silversmiths. Another aspect of the Malays is that political power in the Malay world was very decentralized. There was no overall authority. There was no king of the Malays or anything like that. There was no central authority. Instead, there were dozens and maybe even many more little sultans all around the Malay world, and each usually in charge of a river mouth. Lines of succession also tended to be very vague. It wasn't the case that the oldest son always inherited the crown. Usually the family would get together on the death of a sultan and work out which of the sons would take over, and it didn't have to be the oldest son. And then what that meant was that if there was a fight and the oldest brother who was looked over was annoyed, he would then go off and find his own river mouth and set up his own sultanate. Because back then, there was enough empty space that you could do that. So that's why we ended up with just literally probably hundreds of Malay sultanates, these petty little sultanates everywhere. And the good thing is that with each little sultanate that was set up, each one needed regalia. Each one needed a court silversmith and silver and so on to be, to give them the authority of their position. And this is an interesting thing in Southeast Asia, that what makes you a king or a queen is your possession of the regalia. So that's very different to the causality here, where in Europe, you are the king or the queen, so therefore you get the regalia. But in Southeast Asia, your possession of the regalia makes you the king or queen. It's your possession of the regalia. It's the regalia that confers on you royalty. So very often when the colonialists, so the Dutch and the British, were wanting to deprive power from a sultan, they would make sure they got the regalia and would take it, because that was the equivalent of taking the power away, the source of power from the local ruler. Another aspect of the Malays is that there were not many of them. So that's one reason why there's not much silver and gold around today, as well, apart from being melted for the Hajj and so on. There just weren't that many Malay people. And for example, the Malay population of the Malay Peninsula today is around 14 million Malays, but at the start of the 19th century, it was only 500,000. And the people who had the rights to own this, to own gold and silver, was so much smaller. So that explains why there is so little Malay gold and silver around. And it also explains why, when I showed you earlier, these big pieces that were in the Colonial Museum and so on, why it's just a fiction that is Malay, because it was just inappropriate to have that quantity. One final important aspect of being Malay, of Malayness, that I want to mention is that the Malays, of course, are Muslim. And that's critical to how Malay silversmiths decorated their silver and gold. For religious reasons, the depictions of living creatures obviously are ruled out, but also the Malays went a bit further and they didn't depict anything that was man-made. So again, before I referred to this sort of fake silver having krises and so on it. That's totally un-Malay, even though a kris is a Malay object. No Malay silversmith would have depicted a kris on any item of silver. So no buildings, no columns, nothing like that. It's all about flowers and just interesting geometric designs. The other thing also that's really important is that the decoration on Malay gold and silver is purely decorative. It has no hidden meaning. It's not there for talismanic purposes, by and large. It's not like Chinese silver, where you would have pomegranates, for example, in association with silver made for a wedding. And the pomegranate has lots of seeds, so it's supposed to suggest fertility and lots of children and so on. The Malays had none of that. The Malays simply decorated their silver because they thought it was pretty. And that's, I think, is so endearing. They don't press gang the motives into doing anything for them. It's not going to bring luck. It's not going to bring children. It's just there because they think it looks nice. And I think that's just very charming. So in terms of the Malay aesthetic, the motives of gold and silver were drawn purely from the natural world. And of course, in the Malay world, it was very tropical and lots of jungle and so on. So they had a lot of things they could draw on. And in the book, there's a whole chapter where I identify motive after motive after motive, and then the equivalent in silver. Here's one example. So, I mean, that is blown up so large. I've never seen a screen like this. But so it's a bit out of focus, but you have on the left, a lotus, obviously, and then you've got the Malay version on a piece of silver of how they've rendered a lotus. Here's another example. So on the left, you've got like a foot of a beetle tray. Sort of, it's a tray about this big, and these are the little feet. And then on the right, what you have is where they've copied it from, which is a fruit. It's called a gelugu, and asam gelugu, and it's what Malays will use to put sourness in a curry. So it's across the Malay world, these grow on trees. Here's another one. Everyone will know this one. So it's obviously a star anise, and it's depicted here. This box almost certainly was produced in Sumatra. And so there are around 20 more examples of these in the book. Islamic motives do appear on silver, but again, it's just they're drawing on these motives purely because they like them, not because they wanted them to mean anything or to do anything for them. Here's an example of, I mean, I love this. This is the work on this is so extraordinary. But what you can see in the middle is an octagram, which is overlapping squares, and that's known as the Ring of Solomon. And again, it's purely decorative. It's not talismanic. And this plate is probably about that big, and it's one of the most beautifully engraved Malay plates I've ever seen. So that's motives, a very brief summary of motives on Malay silver. Now, what I'll do is turn to actual objects. Okay, this first one it's a beetle set. So beetle is, or as the Malays will call it, is siri. Beetle sets are one of the most common types of Malay gold and silver that you come across. Beetle, as you probably know, was like a mild social stimulant. So if you invited friends around and at the end of a meal or as part of a wedding, you don't serve obviously alcohol or tea in the way that we might. What you do is you offer beetle and everyone will chew it. And they were served in these quite fine receptacles. These are made of silver and the tops are solid gold with pierced work. Beetle is, I've chewed it actually, and probably some of you have. And it's a bit like when you're naughty at school and you have your first cigarette in the toilets. and you sort of drag on it, and you start to get slightly dizzy. And if you have it, you chew it on this side, and this part of your mouth starts to go dizzy. So numb. I didn't find it particularly pleasant. And then, of course, you don't swallow it. At the end of it, you've got to spit it. And that's quite hard, I find. Actually, I was with years ago with the manager of the Shan State Liberation Army's business interests in Rangoon, and he was getting me to chew betel. And at the end of it, he said, "Well, you just go out into the street and spit." And I was like, "No, I'm not." And but he's going to spit. All right, spit. So anyway, these sorts of objects, these receptacles, would be often put in a box, perhaps such as this example. This is just an exceptional box. It's about the size of like a shoebox. It's quite large. It has a silver substrate, but the covering is repoussed solid gold, and it's been stained red. And this is one of the ironies in Southeast Asia, whether you're in Burma, Cambodia, Thailand, or the Malay world, is that they all love gold, but they don't like its colour. So what they tend to do is to stain it red chemically to improve the colour. And it's one of the ways of identifying what is gold from Southeast Asia, because it will often have a red stain. This box would have come from Sumatra, I think, and being gold, it's very princely. It's just a stunning piece. Oops. Slightly out of order. Right, so this, towards the end of the 19th century, tobacco was introduced, and the Malays would often either smoke it or chew it. And so it gave rise to these boxes, which are called celapa. It's spelled C-E-L-A-P-A. C in Malay is always pronounced as a ch, so it's celapa, not celapa, celapa. And these were used either to hold tobacco or betel, and they were attached usually on a scarf around the neck. You'd have one here, and then something to balance it on the other side, or it could be attached to a belt and worn down here. And it's kind of based on like a Dutch watch case from the 18th century. So whereas a Dutch colonialist would flip it open and have a look at the time, Malay would flip it open and have a chew of some chewing tobacco. And to show you the size, this is one here. So that's the kind of size we're talking about. And they're decorated on both sides and with a hinge that you can flip open. Here's another example. Yep. So this is quite Islamic with obviously the star-type shape. We've got niello work on the sides, and then the plate on the front is solid gold with applied filigree work. And again, as you can see, it's been stained red again, because it's that sort of slightly this sort of dislike of the colour gold, but love for the product nonetheless. Now, next is another example of a tobacco container. Now, this will be about this size. Okay, so it's quite large. And it's known as a chepu. And this is from the Malay Peninsula. And it's made of silver, and then the rim, the outer rim, is made of swasa. Swasa is a mixture of gold and copper. Again, it's to get away from that colour gold. They prefer mixing it with copper because it makes it more reddish. And then in the middle, you've got on the top, you then do have a solid gold plate with applied filigree work and granulation work. The next area that I'll get into are buckles. I'll go back to this. Okay, here we are. So we've got these gentlemen were photographed on East Sumatra in the early 20th century, and you can see they're wearing these quite large buckles, which is the higher up the social ladder you were, the better quality of the material that was used, obviously, to make your buckle. And so these are village headmen, and they probably had silver or gold or a mixture of both for their buckles. Now going back to, so here is a buckle, and this is the sort of size that these were. So it's made of solid silver. On the back you've got this sort of contraption to put the textile through. Malay belts were only ever textile, and only this part was metal. Yeah, buckles. In Islam, men are not supposed to wear jewellery. It's quite an effeminate thing to do, and not masculine enough. And so, what a lot of Malay traditions evolved for men were ways to get around that, so that you could wear jewellery, but you could define it as something else. And so, a buckle really is part of your costume. So, buckles could be elaborate and fabulous and whatever, and you wouldn't be offending Allah or the Prophet by wearing, something so effeminizing because it's deemed to be part of your costume. Another way of getting around this for men who wanted to really dress up with gold and silver was that they'd have a kriss. Some of the krisses are absolutely fabulous, studded with diamonds and whatever. And of course it's ridiculous, but really the best way of understanding a kriss is not a weapon of war, but is actually jewellery for men. What I'll show you next is another buckle. This is solid gold, probably from the Malay Peninsula, and it is decorated with emeralds and diamonds and rubies. It'll be not quite as big as that, sadly, about half the size, but it's a spectacular and rare piece that would have been almost certainly worn by a prince. Here's another example. So where we've got niello work that's been gilded, then we've got gold filigree and then various semi-precious stones. And this is actually certainly this sort of size. That's a big one, and it's very heavy. And it's probably one of the nicest, best Malay buckles I've ever seen. Now, another category of items to do with utensils when it comes to eating. Now, when you... there we go. This is what we should all be doing tonight, I think. When you go to like a traditional Malay feast, rather than bringing out one dish at a time, they tend to bring out lots and lots of dishes. And that requires lots of bowls, lots of things, receptacles are needed to serve it all out at once. And for a sultan's table, the bowls were typically made of silver and possibly gold, although there's one report that was published in 1848 of some English visitors. I think they were English, they could have been Dutch. And they went to the court of the Sultan of Brunei, and they were presented with a curry that was served not in gold but in a porcelain chamber pot. And of course the chamber pot, I'm not sure in Dutch, but the chamber pot is what you would keep under the bed. Yeah, okay. And so they were served. What is it? Fish pot. Oh, yeah. That's is that really? This is very elegant. I didn't know Dutch was so elegant. So they brought out a piss pot, but they put brown curry in it, and they said that the howls of laughter. It was very rude actually to laugh in that, but I think they couldn't help themselves when they saw that. But the other thing that is used a lot are small bowls, small silver bowls. Here's an example, and I have dozens of these, and what's really interesting, so they're about the size of half a coconut, and that's what they're apparently based on, is half a coconut. And all of the decoration on these is on the base, and I was thinking, well, what's the point of that? Why no one's going to see it? Until I realised that when you attend a Malay function and you're presented with the bowls, you sit down and everything's laid out, the bowls are always presented upside down. So when you come in and sit down, it's upside down, and what you see is exactly that. And then you as the diner turn it up the right way and then start to help yourself from the central dishes for your food. So that's why the decoration is always on the base. base. Spittoons are another important aspect when it comes to dining and social behaviour. So this one is large. Again, the diameter is about this. And it looks like a piss pot, this, but I haven't thought that it might be, but I think it's a spittoon. And larger spittoons were important at meals because you could rinse your right hand over it and before you ate. And you could also throw anything that you wanted in it, apart from just spitting. You would also put chicken bones and any other things to clear your bowl or your plate into it. And also, of course, when you were chewing betel at the end of the meal, you need to spit it out and it would go into something like this. This is quite a large example. Now, of course, what I should also point out is just under the rim, you can see this sort of triangular motif. And again, this is drawing on the natural world. That's called a pucat rebung motif, and is a bamboo shoot that goes all the way around. And it's a very, very common motif you see on Malay gold and silver, whether it's from the Malay Peninsula or from Sumatra, for example. This next example is in the National Museum in Indonesia, in Jakarta, at least I hope it still is. As Bruce was saying, there was a fire, and they're not being honest about what was burnt. But this example is from the regalia of the Sultan of Riau, and it's very doubtful that you would ever spit in this. It was really for the Sultan to be seen in public, and he would have a spittoon bearer who would just sort of sit and hold it. And it was part of his sort of motives and emblems and regalia to just show that he was the ruler. Jewellery, of course. Most people, when they think about Malay gold and silver, probably think of jewellery. Jewellery is not my main interest, actually. I'm more interested in all these other objects, probably because other people are not. But for the sake of completeness, obviously jewellery was produced, and it formed a very important function in Malay culture because women obviously wore gold jewellery, men did not. And when a Malay girl was married, her parents-in-law would give her gold and gold bracelets, such as this example. And they were always for the woman to keep, for the bride to keep. And the idea was that in the event of divorce, she would keep it. And so she wasn't pushed into poverty. We used to say in the West that most women were just a husband away from poverty in Europe. But in the Malay world, if in the event of divorce, women were actually often quite well off because they could keep the gold that they had. And as a result, divorce was very, very common in the Malay world. And in fact, by the middle of the 20th century, divorce rates among the Malays on the Malay Peninsula reached around 50%. And there was no social stigma attached to being divorced. And serial marriage was very, very common amongst the Malays. And so rather than this being some sort of bride dowry or bride price or something like that, what it was something that empowered women and Malay women so that they could escape from a husband who was difficult and horrible. And it meant that if they did escape, they weren't impoverished. So it's actually quite a positive thing. And again, these sorts of things explain why divorce rates were so high, because women could exit a marriage. This pair is from the Malay community in Borneo. They're actually dated, they look a bit Chinese, but I would contend that they're probably by a Malay silversmith with Chinese influence. And on the inside, they actually have a date in Jawi, and the date is, I think, about 1910 or something like that. Now, I mentioned that men couldn't wear gold, but boys could. Here's an example. This is a gold necklace that a little prince would have worn. It's decorated on the base there with rubies. And it's talismanic. So this actually is talismanic, whereas adults would not wear items that were talismanic. Only children tended to wear things that were designed to protect them. And the actual pendant is in the form of a breadfruit leaf. So that's where the inspiration has come from for that. Just a few other types of items. So this one, maybe you're all familiar with these, I'm not sure, but this is called a chupping. And it's not that big, it's actually this big, somewhat disappointing. But, and so what people today, sometimes women, you see them wearing them as you know, pendants, and they're quite nice for that. But that's not actually what they were for. This was actually the purpose. So it's what Malay little boys and girls, mostly girls, would wear, just obviously as to hide certain parts. And but very often the motives, if we go back, let me have a look. Yeah, the motives are sort of quite suggestive anyway of fertility. You've got like a beetle leaf, beetle vine in the middle, and beetles always associated with fertility and whatever. And then the other sort of motives kind of mirror, I suppose, the sex organs. So again, it's what you really want is to sort of promote sort of fertility and for the child to grow up and be able to bear children. Here's another type of Malay silver item which is quite ubiquitous or quite common that you often encounter. Now, plates like these were sewn on the end of bolsters or pillows, and often for the pillows that were designed to decorate a wedding bed. And sometimes there'd be stacks of these, and on the end you would have these sewn on, and this actual one is here, so that's how big it is. And all the way around you have these little piercings to allow it to be sewn on the end to the textile, on the end of a pillow. So that they should come in pairs, but they're often in different shapes. And they can be gilded sometimes for a wedding to make it more special or not. This would be from the Malay Peninsula, by the way. Now, one important area of Malay silver and gold that I cover in the book, and in fact there's a whole chapter on this, and this is one of the more innovative aspects of the book, relates to filigree work. And most specifically, gold filigree. Now, it's often said that, the Minangkabau were the great masters of filigree, and that's just nonsense in my view, because I think we're often used to seeing these model Minangkabau houses all done in filigree. I don't know if you've seen that, but the museums here have them. I regard them as quite coarse and not particularly good. But the Malays on Sumatra instead produced some of the finest gold filigree I think the world has ever seen. And this particular kris is really important in the whole story. I was in the Hermitage in St. Petersburg when it was still okay to go to Russia, and it probably never will be again. And I just came across this in a cabinet, and I thought, oh my God, the filigree on this is exactly like what I've seen on other aspects of things that were turning up in London, for example, and were often being attributed to London goldsmiths in the 18th century. And it's this incredible, sort of very fine, very wispy filigree. And anyone who deals with filigree will know how hard it is to do something like this, because when you've got gold like that, it's almost certainly 24 karat, because to draw it out that fine it needs to be very pure. And then some way you've got to attach it to the object that it's going onto. So it needs to be soldered. And when you solder it, the melting point of gold that is so fine and so pure is so low that very often you're going to simply melt it and destroy it. So it's quite remarkable how this sort of work was done. Now, in terms of this sort of filigree turning up on other objects in Europe, this is exactly what I mean. So here we have 3 perfume bottles that date to the 18th century, and are clearly for the European market and particularly for the English market. Now these, even today, will be catalogued as 18th century, possibly London goldsmiths. And so what I was able to determine, particularly on the basis of this kris in St. Petersburg and other sort of pieces of a similar nature, is that this type of filigree almost certainly was done by Malays in Sumatra at the behest of administrators and operatives working for the British East India Company and also the Dutch East India Company. And these things were then being sold back in London and here in the Netherlands. And then to back that up, I found references in late 18th century reports by British traders who were in Sumatra, and they talk about this type of filigree that was being done by the Malays and how popular it had been in London. Here's another example. Now this piece is just amazing, and it's here in the Rijksmuseum. I wish it was. I wish I had it, but so this is from the Lifkes collection. And it's obviously a knight from a chess piece. And I think it's one of the most remarkable examples of Malay gold filigree that I've ever seen. And what's quite exciting is that if it was part of a chess set, there must be a lot of other examples of this around, like if there was a full set. It's interesting to think that it might have been like a gold, the gold side, and the other side could have been done in silver. But so far, this is the only piece that's known. And here's one more example of this sort of work. I found this in Scotland, and it's tortoiseshell with just the finest gold filigree. And again, you can see that just the wispy, I don't know if that translates very well in Dutch, wispy, like gossamer thread. It's incredibly fine, the filigree work that's been done and applied to this box. One final aspect in terms of Malay gold and silver is just the influence of Malay silversmiths on silver and gold across the Indonesian archipelago due to trade and migration. One example seems to of this spreading of this influence, I think, relates to when the Portuguese in 1511 captured Malacca. And you had a lot of Malay refugees coming out of Malacca, and they went to Aceh and to Makassar or Ujung Pandang in Sulawesi and elsewhere. And I think a lot of the artisans were probably court silver and goldsmiths. And when they fled and set up elsewhere, such as in Makassar, they then obviously introduced this sort of Malay influence, so that today you can come across pieces that were produced in Sulawesi, which to me show clear Malay influence. Now this next thing is an example. This flask, now it's about this tall, and the mounts are solid gold. The base is it's a 16th century Ming underglaze blue ceramic base, and I suspect that it was probably used by a local sultan to store Zamzam water, which is the water that comes from Mecca, something so precious that it would have been stored in something as valuable as this. And you can see the top, if you're familiar with sort of Bugis jewellery and so on, the top looks like some of the jewellery that was produced for the Bugis people. Just on this, since a lot of you are collectors, this is something that I own, and it turned up a few years ago in an auction house in Ohio, in Cleveland, Ohio, and it was catalogued as Persian, a Persian bottle with brass mounts. And I looked at it, and the estimate, this is the other thing, the estimate was $40 to $60. And I thought, oh my God, and I knew right away that it was obviously not Persian, that it was from Sulawesi. And then I thought, well, the people in Sulawesi did not use brass like this. So I thought, it's probably silver gilt. So I bid on it, and so the thing went from $40 to $60 to, in the end, I paid $5,000 for it. Which was annoying, but I thought, if I'm right, and this is actually gilded silver, well then that's okay. So then it eventually was delivered to me, and I opened up the box all very excited, gosh, have I got it right or not? Is this brass or not? And pull it out, and it was very dirty, and I thought, what is this stuff? So I went into the kitchen and I cleaned it in our office, and and it started to really sparkle. And I thought, oh, this is strange. And then I got a loop, you know, like a jeweler's loop, and I was going over it, trying to find the silver coming through, because, you know, when it's silver gilt, the silver always comes through, it's been rubbed somewhere. I couldn't see any silver coming through. Then my silversmith came and visited, and I put it down and I said, what do you think of this? And he just looked at it, and neither of us wanted to say what we thought, because you don't want to jinx it, you know. And he said, I think we should go and get it clipped, like a little bit clipped off. That'll be the only way to see what's inside. So we did, and we had it clipped, and it's solid gold. And so I think the $5,000 started to be very cheap. And in fact, the Asian Civilizations Museum asked me to bid on something in London at an auction on their behalf. And it was something, it was Thai, but sort of like this. And they said to me, you know, go to £45,000 for it. And I did, and we still didn't get it. So it taught me that this was quite a bargain. So anyway, just to wrap up, you can see that there's a lot of misunderstanding about Malay silver and gold and about the Malays themselves. And I hope that the book that I've done, which in my view is not just about Malay gold and silver, but tells the story of the Malays through their gold and silver, I hope it, you know, it really fills the gap for what I think is one of the most beautiful cultures in the world. And on that, I'll finish. Thank you so very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. That was a very interesting story about a very little researched area, really. Huh? I didn't realize that before I read your book. One of the topics you address in your book, which attracted my collection immediately, also for the society and its collectors, is that you talk about distortion by collecting, which I think is a wonderful term. And of course you explain something about it because of the Minangkabau, who sort of in a way overproduced because of the Dutch tourism, etc. Could you give other examples of that? But for instance, with the Malay, I was asking myself, of course you explained why there's so little left by themselves also, but I also wondered if their being Muslim may be part of it. Because when we look at what the Batavia's Genootschap, for instance, collected, they sort of left out they favored the Hindu-Javanese period and its style, and they not so much followed up on the Muslim period after that on Java. Could that be the case with the Malay issues, artifacts also?
Right. Okay. There's several issues there. The first is overproduction, or the influence of and distortions which come through the desire to collect on the part of Europeans.
Right.
Another example of this is the British and presumably the Dutch as well, but the British were very good on the Malay Peninsula at setting up sort of agricultural shows and things like that. And included amongst all of that would be silversmithing. And so this tended to stimulate demand in the early 20th century for things like these. And then the British would turn up and buy them as curios.
Yeah, it's really collectible, right?
Yeah, it's just so
very attractive.
It just feels
easy
nice,
to take,
easy
portable.
to take, put in your pocket, and so I think a lot of these were being produced by the silversmiths, not for local consumption, but in a traditional way, to go straight to the sort of souvenir market, but without a denigration of the quality. And one of the interesting aspects of this is that the silversmiths in Brunei, because they wanted to not be confused with the other Malay silversmiths, and so Brunei silver is one of the few things that almost every single piece made in Brunei will say in Jawi on the bottom Brunei. And so when you see that, it's often the things were made for exhibition because they wanted to make it very clear that they were to get the prizes and not someone else. They didn't want any confusion. So there is that. And another aspect in terms of overproduction, when I showed the picture of the stuff that was sort of faked in the name of being Malay, which you find in the museums here now and so on. Another aspect of these are huge tables inset with sort of silver platters. And then I've found several in the UK, and the assumption is that these items were brought to the UK, and then the tables were made, the wood was made to put the Malay silver trays in. But in fact, I found that the wood that was used was a tropical hardwood, and in fact, the tables were made in Singapore. So the intention all the time was to make essentially something for the colonial market. And that coincides when people would go to Egypt or Syria and get these sort of Moorish style Islamic coffee tables. So it's a similar sort of thing, something that you could put on like a passenger sail ship to take back to England or the Netherlands. And then the other point about the Islamic aspect, so I didn't quite understand.
Well, when you look at the Dutch museum collections about Indonesian artifacts, very few items are there from the later Javanese period, the Muslim period, same with Sumatra.
Yes.
So that is also distortion by collecting. Right?
Yes, that's right. Yes, yeah, you're right. Exactly. I understand. Yeah, yeah. There is this thing that everything's Majapahit and Mataram and so on. So we're all very familiar with that, and that's what the Dutch were bringing back and so on. Right. And then we're familiar with the 18th, 19th century, and then there's this very mysterious gap from about the 15th, 16th, 17th century. But that sort of period is really underrepresented. And you think, what on earth was happening? What production was happening during that time? So there's often in museum collections, this whole several hundred years of Indonesian art seems to be missing. And certainly when it comes to these sorts of items.
Right.
So it could well be that when it comes to silver and gold, it was being melted and so on. But it's not clear, and I think more research is needed needs to be done to find out what happened in this sort of missing period, because it's a period.
And could that be the case with the Malay as well?
Yes, well, it is. Yes, Malay is part of the whole broader Indonesia story, but. We have the Mataram and the Majapahit items because they were in the ground and they're made of bronze, so that's easy. And then we have the later period because it coincides with the colonialism, so that's easy. So it's that sort of in-between period of just after Islam, when Islam was introduced. You've got that sort of bit, which is a hole in our collecting and in our knowledge.
Right, good, thank you. Different, we need to.
Okay.
One or two more questions, maybe, and Raymond, go by.
Can we go back to the necklace with the pendant in the shape of a leaf?
Yes. Yes. This is from the Malay Peninsula.
From the
Malay Peninsula.
The Malay Peninsula.
Yes.
It strikes me as very similar to the Turaja Taigansha, which is an amulet worn by females. And the amulet, that's a very interesting thing because it seems to be a Taigansha or a Turaja Taigansha, or this also occurs in Sumba Island called Mamuli, and also occurs in the textiles.
Yes.
I know.
It's a shape which occurs throughout the Southeast Asia.
Yes.
Interestingly, it would seem to be it's a sort of succession of female sex with buffalo horns and crab iconography. But all three relate to fertility. So it's an Islamic thing, but it's a representation in disguise, which is interesting.
Yeah, I think that could relate to.
Everyone understood that, but there's a similarity from also Indonesian islands, and I think also the famous photograph, Raymond, of the Balinese prince and his gold necklace, which was later robbed from him and is now in Leiden, and has this, to me, butterfly-like talisman. So these motifs tend to travel, right? But the interesting thing is that you say that it's not symbolic, not talismanic for the Malay.
Generally.
Whereas in a lot of Indonesian islands it is. It is an amulet. Right? Yes. Yeah, that's your point. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. I think different motives morphed into having different representations in time. And so the Malays would say this is based on a breadfruit leaf. And if you look at a breadfruit leaf, it looks just like it. But I know if you are considering the Minangkabau, for example, they'll say, oh, it's the buffalo horns and so on. So there's often an after-the-fact reinterpretation, I think, of some of these things. Yeah. Yeah. And in the book, there's something similar as well. There's a type, it's like I think it's called a doko, and that the Malays would wear, often in a set of 3. And there's almost an identical version that the Hadramaut people were wearing near Yemen or in Yemen. And then a lot of Yemenites, or Hadramauts from Yemen, came to Sumatra and intermarried with the locals. And they never show up in sort of early colonial census data because basically the British and the Dutch couldn't tell the difference between because they're both Arab, they're both Muslim. But there was a lot of intermarriage. And then the jewellery, there are some examples of jewellery in Yemen that are almost identical that come from the Malay world and vice versa because of this sort of intermarriage and flow.
I need to ask you to continue this discussion in the foyer because we need to clear the room. I'm sorry about that. So you're very welcome to ask Michael more questions or discuss with him in the foyer, and maybe afterwards we can have drinks in the cafe for anybody who's interested to exchange more about it. Yeah, the book, of course, is now in the foyer for sale with a discount for the members, 15% discount. So you're very welcome to have a look and maybe purchase it. Michael, thank you so very much for your interesting piece. People may, and you may maybe quickly come around and have a look at these wonderful pieces that Michael brought from his collection. Thank you for coming and see you next time.